So, Jeff, the time has finally come. It like what feels like an eternity, but we're here. This coming week, my new book is coming out as an ebook, and then it will come out in hard copy, I think, a week or so after that. And the timing is probably pretty good, even though, of course, I wish it had all been kind of completed earlier. I guess most authors think that way. It turns out it's probably pretty opportune timing because so my new book is called Swiftboating America, and we can talk a bit about here in a moment as to why it's called that. But it basically debunks the entire Russiagate hoax, and that includes all parts of it: the Mueller part, the Steele part, the Danchenko part, the Alpha Bank part, all of that. And the reason why I say the timing is kind of opportune is because right now, through the establishment, the media, the elites, and so on, we're seeing this attempted rehabilitation of all those parts. So one of Mueller's lawyers just put out a book where he's trying to basically rehabilitate the entire Mueller Inquisition. And Christopher Steele is putting out a book that is trying to rehabilitate, well, his part in the whole scam. And of course, and I think we talked about this here a few weeks ago. I think we had a whole episode on it. The media has already resurrected or trying to resurrect this guy Danchenko. So while all this is going on, these old hoaxes are being resurrected. The historical record is being manipulated once more. I'm kind of happy to have my book coming out to try and put all that record straight.
Yeah, that's been a long time coming. So it's finally here. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The backdrop, the whole Russia collusion, now we're on what? Russia collusion 3.0, I guess. Kind of depends on how you define it. But it's easy to just say that the left, Democrats, the left, whatever, are resurrecting the Russia collusion narrative. But when you look at it in its pieces, you can start to see how cohesive it's actually been. The Russia collusion narrative started appearing with fervor, maybe 4 months ago, maybe 5 months ago, kind of back on the scene. But since then, we've had a couple of unique and distinct events. And one of those would be what I view as kind of a gift to the DOJ when they realized that some kind of right-wing influencers, I don't really kind of center right-wing influencers, not really our orbit, just happened to be getting paid by a company that happened to be backed by, getting some Russian money in. They didn't know it, but it immediately lended credence to what everybody in the left wants to believe. Russia, Russia, Russia. See, I told you. And you mentioned Danchenko, and at the time, you and I were sort of scratching our heads and doing some pondering. That pondering certainly seems to have been correct in terms of wondering where did this come from. Our take at the time, suddenly Rolling Stone does this big, glossy, lengthy interview and article on Igor Danchenko, who's the primary subsource for Steele's dossier. And our first thought was, what in the heck is this doing here? Why did this suddenly come out of nowhere? Immediately followed by the thought is that there are no coincidences. This has to be part of a larger element. And sure enough, it was. Now we have Steele coming out with his book, trying to represent everything, and that he's going to claim, I'm sure, that I was right all along. And at the same time, you have the book by Aaron Zebley, who was, what was his official title? Wasn't he assistant special counsel? I mean, he was deputy, like at the very, very top.
Deputy special counsel. He was Mueller's deputy. Yeah.
He was the one notch below, Robert Mueller. And now he's got a book coming out where he's going to whitewash and explain the Mueller investigation, why that was always right all along. So when you look at it not as just a resurrection of the Russia collusion narrative, but rather you look at the different distinct points that are being integrated as part of this, suddenly you realize wow, this isn't just, a couple talking heads talking about this. This is effectively a well-orchestrated plan by the left that's probably been in the works for a while leading up to, this current election cycle.
Right. The timing is certainly no coincidence. I can attest that in the case of my book, it's not a coincidence, of course, it being now in terms of, with Trump, after Trump was nominated again and so on. Of course, that was something that was going through my mind, but that was not the initial idea. I mean, the initial idea was to get this out earlier. But then new stuff kept happening, and you have to kind of jump in there and try and reflect some of that. So I mean, when I first started thinking about this, we had about writing a book. We had no idea who Danchenko was. I mean, that's how long this has been sort of in the making, at least kind of in my mind. But I completely agree with you that the fact that they're out there now, all at the same time, trying to rehabilitate, resurrect all their hoaxes. There's a reason behind that, and I don't think it's to fundamentally, convince everyone that whatever Mueller said or Steele said or whatever is true, because that can only last for a while. And then they're disproven again. And so we're in this kind of a pattern. We're in this cycle. So initially, the media was just all over Russiagate, Russiagate, Russiagate. And then little bits of information started seeping out. We're talking, 2016. Then we found out about, Peter Strzok's corruption and so on. Then we found out about, and he was fired from the Mueller team, Peter Strzok was. But just to put this in context, when that happened, we did not even know that Hillary was behind the dossier. We didn't know that until after that. So I'm just looking at some major kind of landmarks along the way. So then we found out about Hillary funding the dossier. Ooh. Then we found out about, I remember there was so many different things about, the whole Mueller team being corrupt. Then we found out about, Papadopoulos had, supposedly started this whole thing.
Finding about the Carter Page FISA.
Of course. How could I? Yeah, no, that's right. There's just so many. So
many
along
things.
the way, we find out all this stuff, and all this stuff debunks those false narratives. So debunks Danchenko's lies, debunks Steele's lies, debunks the Mueller Inquisition, and so on and so forth. And every once in a while, periodically, the establishment, the media, the elites, whatever you want to call it, and some of them are just do it for their I don't know if they're guided or not. I mean, Steele probably, who's going to publish Steele's book? I mean, who in their right mind? The guy's been completely laid bare. He's been completely debunked. Which publisher is going to go, oh, I want to publish this guy's book? I mean,
all of them.
There must be something behind. There must be more behind that. Like, yeah, okay, I've been told we need to publish this. Okay, fine. So I think the purpose is to then give the media something to talk about for another 6 months or a year or something. So despite everything having been debunked, the media get this new hook. Oh, well, Steele says this, or Danchenko, we talked about him already on a previous show. He actually says it's all true and so on. And it's as if we forget, or as if they're trying to make everyone forget that everything's already been debunked. And then the whole process starts over. And they just want to play this process. It's like a cycle. It's a periodic cycle. And they just want to play it out for long enough, play it out for 5, 10 years or whatever, until everyone has sort of forgotten about it. And then hopefully, that's their thinking, they get to have a story in history that's kind of more aligned with their lies than with the truth. And by the way, the same thing happens with COVID. I mean, COVID origin. Is every single time they put out one of these papers saying, oh, it came from nature, that's pretty quickly debunked. But it still gives the media something to talk about. Oh, there's this new paper, this new scientific paper. And then everything gets debunked. And a few months later, the same people put out another supposedly scientific paper. And it's exactly the same cycle over and over. And yeah, eventually, I think they just want to run out the clock and then everyone forgets. And then either best case scenario for them is kind of their story of history is the one that gets recorded. And in a less good case scenario, but still good enough for them, it's kind of, oh, we will never know. Like, we will never know if Trump colluded with Russia. That's kind of where, if we're unlucky, that might be where we end up with. And so anyway, I hope my book will make some, small contribution to actually capturing what really happened. And you don't have to take my word for it. There's over 600 footnotes in there. You can go to all the original citations and documents and so on and see for yourself.
Well, your book also focuses on the 2016 era primarily, correct? In events. Correct. Kind of formulating, because I'm guessing there's going to be another book because there's multiple stages to this. There's kind of eras to the Russiagate events, and there's the 2016, which is the formulation of kind of this tarring Trump, and really what I think they probably thought was just political disinformation against a upstart candidate that they didn't think was going to go anywhere, and that started to build and build and build, and ultimately led into something much larger. Now we'll come back to the book in a minute, but going back to this Russia collusion narrative, I guess I kind of have personal theory here, and that is the first thing that came out wasn't Danchenko, it wasn't Steele's book being announced, it wasn't Aaron Zebley. The first thing that came out was sort of what shots over the bow, like attempts, like just dry runs at the Russia collusion narrative and seeing if the left bit. And sure enough, the left not only bit, they took it in hook, line, and sinker all over again. There was rabid enthusiasm for it. And I see these things coalescing as a preface to a second Trump administration. They're not rolling it out soon enough to where I think it could be an impact for the actual election. I see it as being kind of a pre-scale weaponization for what they probably think is the inevitable Trump 47, and that they want to use that to kind of as part of their process. There's been big planning. We know about it. Mary, what's her, Lisa Monica, why am I suddenly blanking? Mary McCord.
Right.
She's there. That whole lawfare group has been engaged in two facets. One, the lawfare against Trump that we're seeing currently, and secondarily, the preparations for a Trump administration as to how to hobble that administration. And I think this resurrection of the Russiagate narrative is part of that, is part of the preparation, not so much for the pre-election, although they'll utilize it, but rather for what happens if and when Trump actually becomes president. Maybe you could just walk through a little bit, kind of what you're covering in the book. What's the period, what you're looking at, what's your focus? And by the way, one last thing and I'll let you jump in. There's a group of us that were kind of joking about this online, but with Steele's book, with the idea being that maybe you should just jump in on his book schedule and follow him wherever he goes and debunk literally every place where he's doing a book tour with a tour of your own.
I'd be surprised if anyone would have him. But then again,
I think there's going to be a good reception, is my guess.
It's just it's not it's not just there's no evidence for what he says in his Steele dossier.
It's that counter disproving evidence.
It's actually been disproven. It's not just lack of evidence. It's just been positively disproven. All of it. Well, Danchenko, the so-called primary subsource for the entire dossier, dismissed the whole thing. I mean, that's part of course, what the book is about. The fact that in early 2017, the FBI knew that the guy who was the supposed source for everything said it didn't happen. This was just like, we were just like in a bar and we were just kind of rumoring and gossiping and so on.
But that's why the Rolling Stone article is out there. That's why they resurrected and rewrote Danchenko. That had to be done first to set the stage for Steele to come back.
Right, and I agree with you. It's other than the periodic recycling of these things for the reasons I talked about, and stretching out over time to the point where we kind of forget, and then their version of history prevails. I completely agree with you. There's probably an element here as well of what to do about Trump when he gets back in, or if he gets back in, and this time they will have had a lot more time to plan for that, because they didn't really expect it in 2016 and they kind of scrambled when it happened. The book is a bit about that too. This time, of course, it's been at least kind of 50-50 for at least a year now. So there's a real possibility it will happen, and I'm sure they're planning for it. So in terms of the book, I mean, I said I would come back to the title, and I think this is very important because it's really the starting point. So the book is called Swiftboating America, but initially I thought of calling it Swiftboating Trump. But then as I kind of thought more about it, and as I was writing it, I was like, no, this isn't actually just Trump. This is all of America. So the word comes from, of course, swiftboating is what happened with John Kerry back in 2004, where John Kerry was a swiftboat captain in Vietnam, and then he was attacked by other Vietnam veterans and so on. And then anyway, they called it swiftboating. So that's like a political attack. And the earliest reference that we have to the Russiagate hoax is in an email within the Clinton campaign, and that email came out through WikiLeaks. it wasn't really noticed at first. It was noticed much later.
Yeah. Didn't have relevance at the time.
Correct. It was just one of tens of thousands of emails. So it's a February 2016 email in which they discussed the Swiftboat campaign or Swiftboat project against Trump. So that's kind of the starting point of the book, because it's the earliest reference we have to the Russiagate hoax. That doesn't mean that there weren't plans, Russiagate plans going on earlier. And, we discussed this before, where you think it probably started in 2015. But anyway, the reason I chose that as a starting point is simply we have proof. We have proof that as of that date, the plan existed. So this is February of 2016. Maybe I'll just, do you want to jump in and explain when you thought it started?
Yeah, but before, I just was looking it up because, what you were talking about, that little known email exchange, it involved, once again, it's always familiar names. It was Jennifer Palmieri, Clinton strategist, and Democrat strategist Joel Johnson. And, that was the existence of the Clinton the Clinton campaign. It's always Hillary Clinton, isn't it? A Swiftboat project. And, saying something to the effect of, where do we stand on our Swiftboat where's the Swiftboat project at with Donald Trump? And like you said, that got overlooked, but now that becomes kind of the date to go back that, hey, planning was was really going. Now, the reason why I think it goes back a little bit earlier, although I think your title is 100% apt, because that was obviously things were very loose at that point. That was the moment things were coming together. I still sort of point back to Fusion GPS, and they're getting their kind of operation up and running back in September 2015. Glenn Simpson, and it was with the Orrs when he hired Bruce Orr's wife to begin to do research for Fusion GPS, and she was designated with doing research specifically on Trump, his family, and the Trump campaign in September 2015. And to me, I figure that about a month before that was probably when some Democratic strategists began to realize that, hey, wait a minute, Trump might be a little bit of a bigger threat. Everybody's thinking he's a joke at this point in time, that he might actually be a little bit bigger threat than's being given credence, and we need to start ramping up our work. And I think it was that moment in time that things actually kind of began. Certainly, we know factually that the research into the Trump campaign began at Fusion GPS at that point in time. But I'm not sure that was being taken with any regard by kind of the larger DNC strategists. And that Swiftboating project, that's when it really coalesces and begins to formulate. And of course, we know from all the actions that it wasn't until April that Fusion was even hired by the Clinton campaign. Steele was then brought on board, and everything really took off.
Right. And so the book covers the book covers all kinds of things, events like Horowitz 2019 and Danchenko 2020 and so on. But kind of as at its core, the book covers the period from the initiation of the Swiftboat project in February of 2016 to Trump's inauguration. Again, that doesn't mean other things aren't talked about, but that's sort of the core of it. And the reason why that's the core of it is because everything started to coalesce around this Clinton Swiftboat plan after February of 2016. They hired, they got Perkins Coie, the lawyers, to run the project. Then they got in touch with Fusion GPS, and Fusion GPS hired Steele, and Steele hired Danchenko, and everything, all parts of that kind of cog started coming together. Of course, Michael Sussman, another Perkins Coie Clinton operative, he got together with these IT operatives that later pulled off the Alpha Bank hoax. This was also early, April 2016. So that whole period of time is covered as to how all these little bits and pieces came together. And then, of course, the trap was sprung in July of 2016 when you had Robbie Mook come out and say, oh, the Russians are trying to get Trump elected. Experts are telling us. He went on CNN and said that. July 24th, 2016. That was kind of when the trigger was pulled. And the experts were his own people, the people hired by the Clinton campaign, the dirty tricks operatives. Those were the experts, literally, that he was on CNN saying, oh, the experts are telling us the Russians are trying to elect Trump. And then the whole thing morphed. And that's why I think this 2016 period is so incredibly interesting. Because a few days after Mook did that, the FBI got in on the act, July 31st. So that's a week after Mook went on CNN. And they started their Crossfire Hurricane investigation into Trump. And of course, that got worse and worse and ramped up more and more as we went along.
That sucked in all of Congress.
Exactly. Culminating then in this ICA, which is the Intelligence Community Assessment, which they only really started writing after Trump was elected. Because again, what we talked about, it was kind of such a big surprise. Well, we need to do something about this guy. We need to, hobble him or worse. And that was the instrument that they did it with. And of course, the ICA was all based on the initial idea of Trump is colluding with Russia, or at a minimum, Russia elected Trump. He didn't just get elected because Americans wanted a change or whatever. No. This was Russia. That's what the ICA is. So the book basically tells a story of how a Clinton dirty trick pretty quickly morphed into sort of an all-encompassing government plan to take down Trump. And it did, to be honest, hobble, and more than hobble, his entire presidency. And, in the epilogue, I write about the fact that a lot of the bad things we see in the world today, most importantly, I think this new alliance between Russia and China, the Ukraine war, and everything that's going on in geopolitics, this whole bifurcation, it can't necessarily be traced back to the Russiagate hoax. It can probably be traced back to Joe Biden greenlighting the coup in Ukraine in 2014. But without the Russiagate hoax, which criminalized diplomacy with Russia, which was one of the things that Trump ran on, that he said, well, let's try and get along with them. Let's try and talk to them. There's no reason we don't have to be best friends, but let's try, right? That was Trump's credo. He said that over and over in 2015, 16, and so on. And he was never able to do that. He was never allowed to do that. Because diplomacy was criminalized. Anytime he spoke to the Russian ambassador came to the White House, which is the most normal thing. Ambassadors come to White House every day. Remember, the media had a complete meltdown. Anytime anything happened with Russia, there was a giant meltdown. So his hands were tied, and and of course that all morphed into the whole impeachment hoax. His hands were tied in terms of doing anything with Zelensky and Putin back in 2019. So the sort of the overarching conclusion out of all this, again, all this meaning that a Clinton dirty trick became into a government plot to take down a president. All of this, as its consequence, now has that we're living in a completely different world, a much more dangerous one, a completely different geopolitical order, and one that's going to be around, unfortunately, long after we're both dead. I mean, this is going to be around for a very, very long time, and we can, unfortunately, trace it back to this.
I think that's one of the things that you and I have tried to impress upon people is the way in which these actions fundamentally altered, not just kind of divided the nation along political lines, but also weaponized our foreign policy and fundamentally altered it. You talked about the Trump administration being hobbled. I always viewed it maybe a touch differently, in that I felt like the Trump administration began to get their footing in the beginning of year 3 of his administration. But just as he recovered his footing, they still used an aspect of the Russia collusion narrative to come in and weaponize that phone call, that Ukraine phone call with Zelensky, and then that led to the impeachment. So they took that right when Trump began to regain strength. They were able to enter it from another angle, from the Ukraine angle, and then start all over again, and we move into the impeachment phase, which hobbled him all over again. Going back to the start of this, there's 2 other events that I kind of point fingers at. You mentioned, first of all, Robbie Mook. You mentioned that. And I think it was a matter of like 2 days later, I forget the exact sequence, but Michael Isikoff interviewed General Flynn at the Republican convention, and it was a complete ambush interview where he brought up his RT dinner in Russia. And that was like the second stage of following in Mook's footsteps of this Russia collusion, and that it's embedded in the Trump campaign, and Flynn epitomizes that. And that's another element in this kind of soft steps they were taking towards a hard Russia investigation. And the other aspect, again, going back to the ores, Nellie Ore specifically working with fusion, really the first thing that they did was bringing in the aspects of, once again, Ukraine, the Black Ledger tied to Paul Manafort. Now, the famous Black Ledger, which the New York Times started off, and that really started before the Russia collusion stuff. That the first person that I've been able to find, whoever had any information on that, was Nellie Orr, who got it the one day after this Ukrainian blogger wrote about it. And she's transmitting all of this information in April and in May directly into the DOJ through her husband, Bruce Orr. And it wasn't just Bruce Orr on the emails. There was Lisa Holton, a couple other people, I don't remember their names off the cuff, that was getting this information on Manafort and the supposed Black Ledger, which, by the way, as far as we can tell, is a complete fabrication and doesn't actually exist. And that was kind of the first step. And they blew up Manafort using the Black Ledger as they were formulating their larger Russia collusion narrative. So you see these different kind of seemingly disparate steps all coalescing into a funnel, really twin funnels, of just an amplification of this narrative that then got absolutely weaponized throughout the entirety of DC. So
I completely agree with you. It just got ramped up again and again because what was being done, you couldn't get rid of Trump. It didn't so first the MOOC thing, then it was public, July 2016. Well, didn't have the desired effect. Okay, so then the FBI opens its investigation. Then you have the Manafort thing, the Black Ledger, which, by the way, is directly tied to all this in the way you describe. And also, of course, the fact that one of the immediate targets of the FBI in this fraudulent Crossfire Hurricane investigation, and by the way, in the book I explain how it really started, not this Papadopoulos crap, that you hear and so on. How did that thing really start? Anyway, that targeted Manafort right away. Like, why? If it's Papadopoulos, why would they target Manafort? I mean, it's a kind of rhetorical question, but so that was more than a shot across the bow. By that point, they literally got rid of Trump's campaign manager. That's what he was at the time. And yet Trump, it didn't affect him. He was still doing, maybe it affected him in the polls for like a few days or whatever. And, back in 2016,
it made a huge amount of noise and not a great repercussion.
Exactly. I mean, people really, it was a very special time. I remember just living through it. It was an amazing time. In a way, things still seem very innocent because I wasn't, for instance, aware of all the FBI corruption and all these agencies being corrupt and so on. But there was some true hope that this outsider could come in and really do things. And then, unfortunately, he wasn't able to do most of those things because, my theory anyway, is because he was hobbled by all this Russia crap. But yeah, all these, so they got rid of Manafort, but then that didn't achieve the desired outcome. Okay, then in September, they ramped it up again. They put out all these articles about Carter Page and Russia collusion, and Hillary started running ads about Russia collusion and so on.
Alpha Bank,
October, they ramped that one up. I mean, and each time Trump was still standing, and then he won. And then they really ramped it up with the ICA, which is simply treason. That thing is treason. There's no other word for it. And then, of course,
anybody out there hasn't read that document, they should go look at it and see what an utter joke that piece of garbage is.
Yeah, it basically says RT did a bad story about Hillary Clinton, therefore Putin elected Trump, in a sentence. And then, of course, they hobbled his entire presidency. Now, on that point, what you said earlier is the transition between Russiagate and Ukrainegate is so seamless. It's completely unreal. And I talk about this in the book. Remember when Robert Mueller came to Congress, senile old man. And anyway, long story short is he admitted there was no collusion, no evidence of collusion. Sorry, we looked at it for 3 years, didn't pan out. The next hoax, this Ukraine hoax, started the next day. It was the next morning after Robert Mueller went to Congress. That's how seamless it was.
Yep. And there was always an element of intertwining between the two because the counterpart to Ukraine is Russia. So it was always kind of easy to bounce back and forth. And of course, Ukraine had been involved in interfering with our election, through their own ambassador writing a full-page editorial early on in 2016 as to why Trump shouldn't be president. So
their own prime minister on Facebook absolutely tearing into Trump.
Yep.
Various other characters, ministers, secretaries, and so on in Ukraine.
That's all part of the reason why I've maintained for a long time that I think one of the reasons we got Russiagate was to hide all the bullshit and corruption that Joe Biden was doing in Ukraine as a vice president, as Obama's vice president, really not so much to protect either Ukraine or Joe Biden, but rather to protect Obama. I think that's a big element in what actually happened. There's one other element too, when you talked about kind of this ferocity, this ramping up, the attacks becoming more and more serious. There was one other attack as well, and came from kind of an unusual source, and that was Ben Witz over at Lawfare, affiliated with Brookings. And he was probably one of the Dem strategists who really saw fairly clearly that, oh my God, Trump is absolutely going to win this thing. He penned that editorial saying a call to all Democratic arms that if the unthinkable happens and Trump wins, we need to be ready to ramp up our lawfare against his new administration. And he wrote that at a moment in time when everybody, the world, was convinced that, of course, Clinton's going to win. Trump still doesn't, even though he survived and he was the candidate, people didn't think that he was going to win. And Witz was positive that he was going to win and was panicked about it. And that set off the whole lawfare chain. So it's all these different tendrils taking place to formulate attacks.
And of course, another huge coincidence here is that Danchenko was also at Brookings. And and then
the Ukraine Brookings Atlantic Council threads are everywhere.
Danchenko's mentor at Brookings was Fiona Hill, the crown witness in this impeachment, the impeachment hoax in 2019. So over and over, you have these overlaps, which of course, some of them may be down to a coincidence, but not all of them.
There's maybe one other element that's worth kind of touching on here, and it sort of, I think, probably took you a little bit by surprise. It's very easy for us as longtime Russia investigators to sort of a little blindly assume that everybody by now knows the things that we know. And, in particular, like working on X, et cetera, the people that we tend to interact with, they know all these things. But every now and then we get these little eye-opening moments to realize just how much kind of the general public still doesn't understand about what actually happened out there. And you were able to go through that in the process of having, friends and family take a look at some of the drafts. Maybe you can just touch on that.
Yeah, no, that was certainly an eye-opener. So there are some things in there that are completely novel, and they will all in the book that will also be novel to Russiagate researchers. There's some novel information on this mysterious professor Joseph Mifsud. There are some novel messages from a secret chat board to do with this Alpha Bank hoax. I mean, there are a number of just new things. But of course, I mean, many of these things that will be familiar to you and I and, our friends, Steve McIntyre, Walker Fire, Phil Nelson, many, many others, because that's what we've been covering for the past, 7-8 years or however long it's been. But you're exactly right that some very simple facts. For instance, the fact that the FBI hired Danchenko before they ever spoke to him. That's just a fact. That's what happened. When I showed, and this is, for instance, for just looking at the draft in terms of language, just having a second pairs of eyes looking at it, I would get questions like, "Oh, you got this wrong. You must have gotten this mixed up. This you say before, you meant after, right?" I'm like, "No, they hired him before." how's that possible? So you're right. A lot of these facts, which we almost take for granted because we've been looking at this stuff for so long, um, they are very surprising to the normies out there, right? And that's something we should never lose sight of. And I think that's actually quite a unifying thing, that if the normies knew the truth about so many things, and this is just one part of a much wider universe, but it's a pretty important part for the reasons we just discussed here, because it's what brought us to the precipice of World War III. If the normies understood what actually went on here, another one, for instance, is this whole Newland issue in 2014 that we've talked about, on our show here before, where Joe Biden greenlighted the coup in Ukraine. No, that can't be right. So there's a number of things where, I was it was eye-opening to see that just normies who don't cover this stuff, who don't know more about Russiagate than what they've heard kind of on the periphery, people are just not into this stuff, are absolutely shocked by. And I think that's just important to bear. We're not going to kind of re-educate. I don't like that word, but anyway, we're not going to do that to everyone. But just a realization that a lot of this apparent division and hatred and all that in society isn't fundamental. It's often about people just being based, their whole opinions, their whole kind of worldview is based on false information. That's at the core of so many problems.
That's one of the reasons that I've always I've always maintained timelines and utilized them extensively. Because when you walk through the timeline of events and you see where actual events fall and what precede them and what follow them and what happens simultaneously with them, all of a sudden you have, and I still can get it going back and looking at information today, even though I know it, and being like, oh my God, I forgot how utterly bad that was. It places things into a proper perspective where you can no longer, it becomes very difficult to maintain this narrative that everything was just by accident. You see what actually happened, and it forces you to look at something as it's very difficult to accept the narrative at face value any longer when you see those things placed in the proper perspective. And, that's what your book is doing.
Another one that I can just came to mind, that caused a lot of incredulity was the opening of Crossfire Hurricane. Apparently, I thought everyone knew this, but apparently that's not the case. So the chief reason, official reason, why it was opened is because this guy called Alexander Downer, an Australian diplomat, came forward with a tip. Officially, that's the thing. And that tip was about George Papadopoulos. By the way, the tip was completely benign. There was really nothing to it. He basically Papadopoulos just said something that, Fox News says every day. I mean, there's nothing to it. Anyway, even if we leave that aside, the book describes, how that unfolded. And so as soon as Peter Strzok and FBI leadership knew that there was such a tip, they immediately opened what's called an enterprise investigation, which kind of in FBI parlance is this sweeping, huge investigation of the Trump campaign. And then I write in the book what happened in the weeks after that. And then one of the things that happened after that is that Peter Strzok went to see Downer. He flew to London to talk to Downer. And again, I got these, no, you got that wrong. I think that happened before, right? And I'm like, no, that happened after. So investigation first, talk later, or just talking to the main witness. I mean, this is the first time they would have talked. The first time they would have asked the main witness any questions whatsoever. And of course, by that time, and we now know that Downer basically said, well, there's really nothing to it. That's what he told Strzok, or he recounted again what he had said earlier, which is basically that Papadopoulos said, that Russia might have Hillary's emails, roughly. Well, if you go back to media in 2016, early 2016, everyone was saying that. You can find tons of articles saying exactly that, and yet that's what triggered Strzok to. Allegedly triggered Strzok to open the investigation. Well, once he went to London a week after or whatever and talked to Downer and realized this is, if we assume this is all, legit, he should have shut it down because there was nothing to it. But how can he shut it down having already opened this giant enterprise investigation, right? So this is just looking at it from a normie point of view. We know, of course, it was open for other reasons and so on, and this is described in the book. But just from a normie perspective, again, I was very, maybe not surprised, but it was eye-opening to get these questions about, no, you have the timing wrong. And that happened a few times, that people just assumed automatically that one thing had to come before the other. But in truth, it was inverse.
And that's one of the elements that makes this story so hard to explain to people, is there's so many diverse elements that are happening almost simultaneously, although there is a certain chronological order to them, that when you view them individually, there's always, you can kind of come up with explanations or narratives. But when you see them in the whole, it's impossible to see it as anything other than it is. And that's why presenting this as a story that runs throughout, all of the pieces come together and they create a picture that is very, very different than the narrative that's been presented to us by the mainstream media.